I do want to actually talk about what the insulin shock was like, because there's not very many of us who are still alive who experienced that, and I think it should be part of the public record, that the historical record, that this is what happened. And they would wake us up in the morning. I was in in a hospital called Baldpate in Massachusetts, a tiny little place, cinder blocks with one room and a nurse's station, and there were 4 teenage girls. And I just think that's an interesting fact too. No boys, just 4 teenage girls. And I guess we were all depressed, and we were lined up in 4 beds, 6 in the morning. And first we were given a shot of insulin to try to put us in a coma. And then 3 days a week, the electric shock guy would come in the room, and he would carry a little black suitcase, and in the black suitcases were his shock machine. And he would set it up behind our heads. We'd be laying on our back. He'd said they do one at a time, so I wasn't first always, and so you could see it being done to someone else, and there was no anesthesia, no nothing at that time. And they would say, "Is everybody ready?" And that meant that a nurse was holding down each of my limbs, 2 arms, 2 legs, and they said, "Is everybody ready?" And they were talking to them. They were not talking to me. And then then the machine would zap me. And of course, at that point, I would be having a seizure, and I would wake up however many, I don't know how long later, an hour or 2 later. I don't know how long, but I would wake up with a crashing headache. And then it was horrible. It was really horrible. And this went on for 6 weeks. And one of those days, Susan Kelly died. She just didn't wake up from one of those insulin shock sessions. And so I just, I have very strong feelings about shock. I know there's some people who think it's great and it saved their life, but I will never be one to say that you should have electric shock. I mean, insulin killed so many people, they don't do it anymore. All I really started out being was sad because my boyfriend broke up with me. That's how it all started. I was like sad. A freshman in college, a little sad. And didn't have anyone to talk to. And I think then I got way behind in my work. And then I took an overdose, just kind of a half-hearted overdose of aspirin, and told my parents, and that's how it started. It's a very complicated psychosocial situation in a hospital among people who have been locked up against their will. Because, at least for us teenagers, we were all vying for love, we were all vying for attention, and the people who behaved the worst, the people who, really hurt themselves and really misbehaved, got the most attention, but it kept us there longer. And so, but nothing worked. We behaved, we didn't get out. And so then the flip side was to not be angry that they weren't letting you out. So I could go on and on, but it's a complex situation. And I just still feel that I was in a war and survived because of that anger. I was totally crushed by the system. I was crushed by being put in there in the first place, when all I was a little sad. I was then, completely crushed by the seclusion, the restraint, the Thorazine, and the Thorazine, the Thorazine, which I didn't actually need. I mean, it put me to sleep, but I mean, my tongue would swell up. I could only shuffle along the floor, and I can only say that it practically killed me. The system practically killed me. It killed my roommate. I think that the kids that I knew who committed suicide after they got out, I think the system killed them as well. I think most people who go in really want a little affection. They want to be heard. They want some caring. They want some love. I think loss of love is probably the number one reason why people get into trouble. I finally met an amazing guy who was 24 years old. He was a resident in psychiatry, and he just basically said, there's nothing the matter with you. He said, there's nothing the matter with you, and your behavior in there was caused by how they treated you. And it was the first person who totally made sense. He was my advocate. I mean, he basically was an advocate for me. And then I would just sit and chat with him once a week. Just chat, just talk, you know. He listened to me, he smiled, he was great. He mothered me. He was basically a fabulous mother to me. I haven't even talked about the moment when my life totally changed. I was going to a talk at a hotel in Boston. This is after I'm married, after I have 4 children. My children are very young at the time. And I'm going to this hotel with my husband to hear a speech about psychiatry. And I see there's a little sign saying MPLF, and I didn't even know what MPLF was, down in the basement. And so I saw the little arrow. I must have said Mental Patients Liberation Front. It must have had giant M, ENTAL, you know, liberation. Otherwise I wouldn't have bothered to go down. But I went down, I thought, what is that? And I went down to the basement, and there was Judy Chamberlain reading from her book, On Our Own, and I just couldn't believe it. Because, say I got out of the hospital in '63, at that point, it was 1978. You know, so that I'd been out of the hospital all that time and leading a regular life. I always, you know, everything that happened to me was part of me, but at that point I was very busy raising children. And so I wasn't worrying a lot about being crazy, or I love the word crazy. I feel like the word crazy is extremely, it's a great word for expressing how you feel when you're in there. It's just a great word. I like it. A lot of people don't like it. I love the word crazy. It's very expressive. But I think I was going along raising the children, but there was all this stuff underneath, sort of almost from the neck down, or maybe from the heart down, or the neck down, or something. I can't quite figure out, because certainly all that stuff was in my heart. All those people, Susan who had died, and all those people I was locked up with who were really my comrades, they were always within me, all those people that I was, and I have to just say to you, the best education I ever had, and that includes everywhere I've ever gone to some really good schools, including graduating from college. Best education was those years I spent in mental institutions. I learned more there about life, more about survival. I learned basic survival skills in those hospitals. And I think a lot of that, and I learned how to care about someone else. I learned how to fight for somebody else. I learned about the things that I think are really important in life. Never mind Latin and French, you know, never mind. But anyway, I went down and met Judy Chamberlain. I was completely amazed that there was a group down there of people just like me. And she said, well, come to the meeting. We meet every Monday night. And so my life changed. From that moment on, we met every Monday night. And that's when I met David Oakes, Dan Fisher, Judy Chamberlain, and 3 or 4 other people who those are the 3 who really stuck it out. And David, of course, has spent his whole life working on these issues. And Dan has spent his whole life working on these issues. And I took a sideline because I had 4 children, and I couldn't, at that point, where suddenly I was grabbed by this huge human rights desire to, completely go out into the world and just change the world. But after, and I started writing for I wrote op-ed pieces for the newspaper. I literally, on my table up here, I would set up my little typewriter with carbon paper, because there was no such thing as a computer, and I would write op-ed pieces. Then I would go to the library, the Newton Library, and I would get out this great big book that had a list of all the newspapers in the country. And I would look for the newspapers that had more than 100,000 circulation. Someone told me to do that. And so then I'd make a list of those newspapers and their addresses, and I'd go get envelopes, carbon paper, and I would literally send my op-ed piece out to 50 newspapers. And I adore the Miami Herald because they printed one. The Boston Globe printed 3 or 4. Detroit Free Press printed one. And every now and later, and I would also write letters to the editor. I was completely obsessed, just the way I see these younger kids now, who are pretty much around the same age that I was when I first met everybody. They're obsessed. Some of them are obsessed with speaking out. Some of them are, obsessed with writing. One young woman that I know who is she's a really good writer, and she writes, and she writes beautifully. She is, that's how I felt back then. I was writing 24/7. And I would be up really late at night because in the daytime I had to take care of the children. I think I did an okay job, yeah. If they were here, they would, there they are on the wall behind me. That's how old they were when I met all my comrades.